I hope everyone is now suitably caffeinated after the coffee break and after the excitement of the results this morning. Hi to also those who are joining this broadcast online. This session is on engaging students to develop creativity and creative thinking skills. So we're going to be staying on the topic of creative thinking, but hopefully taking a deeper dive into what it means to be, for educators to encourage students to engage creative thinking. And we touched a little bit on curriculum design and the challenge being in implementation, and hopefully we can take a bit of a deeper dive into what it takes to design good learning experiences for developing creative thinking. My name is Natalie Foster. As Mario said, I work with Mario on developing the innovative domains, and I've had the pleasure of working on creative thinking right from the very beginning and through to writing the report. So this is kind of a full circle moment for me, and it's a very happy day to share the results with everyone and to hear the conversations that are happening. Since we started working on the project, one of the main questions we've been asked is, well, what can teachers do to actually develop their student skill in creative thinking? How do you teach for this? And so hopefully we have two great experts here with us today who can help to shed some light on that. So we're joined by Dr. Carl Wyman, who is an emeritus professor of physics in education at Stanford University, who's been widely recognized for his research both in physics and in university science and engineering education. He directed the science education initiatives at the universities of Colorado and British Columbia, and also served as associate director for science in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And he also founded the PhET simulations, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, that are used by hundreds of thousands of students across the world. We also have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Mickey Chi, who's Regents Professor and Director of the ICAP Center for Teaching and Learning at Arizona State University. Her research has focused on active learning and how students develop expertise. And she's also garnered many honors in the field of psychology and education. You'll forgive me for not going through them all, Mickey. But they've recognized her pioneering research in the learning sciences and the practical application to promote active learning and engage student learning. So thank you both for joining us for this session. Now, before I invite them to impart their wisdom with us, I just want to set the context a little bit for this session by recalling some of the data from the PISA study that I think is particularly relevant. So the first point is that the PISA data show in general students are curious learners inherently. They like to learn. From Andreas's presentation, you saw that one of the indicators or one of the items from openness to intellect, I enjoy learning new things, was one of the strongest predictors of performance. And across the OECD, over 70% of students reported that they enjoyed learning new things. But what's interesting is when you ask students whether they enjoy learning things in school, less than half of students agreed with that statement. So clearly there's a disconnect between the types of learning that's happening in school and the types of learning that's inherently enjoyable for students and that engages their curiosity in learning. The second point is that the results showed that students whose teachers reported the use of more active pedagogies, where they valued students' creativity, they gave them time to come up with different ideas or original ideas, those students performed better in the assessment too. So we have also some evidence that we can contribute to the other evidence that exists that these types of pedagogies actually work in developing these skills. And particularly, those students perform better in the more difficult items of the test. And we didn't see any data on this already, but as Todd mentioned, we assessed students in different contexts. And generally, when you look at their performance in different types of tasks, students struggled the most to think creatively in scientific problem-solving contexts. But as Andreas said, the science domains, the STEM disciplines are actually a really fruitful context for engaging students in inquiry, in questioning, in constructing knowledge and learning by doing. And so given the wealth of expertise we have on stage particularly in the STEM disciplines, that's what we're going to focus on today. So without further ado, I'd first like to invite Carl to share your reflections with us on active learning in the STEM disciplines. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, can I have my, okay, yes. So I'm going to talk about teaching creativity and critical learning in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And first, OECD has identified these two as sort of critical skills that are essential for the 21st century. And their critical thinking and creativity are important really in many aspects of life, but I think they sort of have a special place and a particular challenge in the teaching of STEM, and particularly in engineering and science is what I'll focus on. And so I'll start with just talking about in general what I see these really mean in the STEM context, and then I'll talk about teaching them here. So creativity, as defined by the OECD, slightly abbreviated, is the generation, solution, and improvement of ideas that can result in original and effective solutions or knowledge. Or another simpler way to say this is just creativity is thinking about things differently than the way other people are doing that. Now, in STEM, one distinction from creativity more generally is in STEM, really, to be creative, it's not just different, but it also has to be useful. It's got to help to solve novel problems or provide new insights. And so if you think about the basic expertise in STEM, it's really about solving scientific problems in science and engineering, and solving novel problems. And so that sort of inherently means you have to have some level of novel thinking, creativity, to do that kind of problem solving. But in STEM in particular, I'd argue that it needs to not just be novel, but it also not just creative, it needs to have critical thinking involved. And the reason I say that is really that in STEM, if you think about what critical thinking really is, it's asking questions and making good decisions as part of the problem-solving process. And so things like recognizing and applying relevant information, avoiding common biases, judging one's assumptions and quality of information you have, and using logic and reasoning to make these decisions. And so this kind of critical thinking is, and plus knowledge is really essential for the, if you like, the evaluation and improvement aspect of novel ideas in STEM, to really make sure that they're good for doing something. And so, my claim is really you can't have creativity in STEM without having critical thinking, that they really essentially go together, and the combination is really a key part of expertise in the fields. So that's sort of the background. Now I'll talk about how to teach it. And I think before I do, I'll say there's some good OECD reports prior to the one reported today on teaching creativity and critical thinking sort of in general, and they're filled with lots of references and data, and as is the one. And so the work I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to skip over not providing lots of references, just kind of a high-level summary. But you'll see considerable overlap with what has been said in those reports and also in some of the earlier comments made today. But I'm going to provide some sort of personal views on the teaching of this and the nature in the STEM context. So how do you actually go about teaching these things? Well, the first and most kind of important principle of this is the idea that people learn the thinking that they practice with some sort of guiding feedback. And so if they want them to learn creativity and critical thinking, they've got to actually be practicing doing that. Now, if you look at most STEM teaching, however, particularly at the higher grades and especially in systems with high stakes examinations, they're really not providing that sort of thinking practice at all, but they're giving knowledge and procedures and practicing, essentially memorizing them and repeating them on the exams and assessments. And so they never really practice these thinking skills, and they're almost never really exposed to them on the assessments and courses. And so to change things, to actually be teaching, particularly starting with critical thinking, you need to have the students learn that by practicing solving authentic STEM problems, and practice critical thinking by making and justifying the essential problem-solving decisions that we've identified. There's a certain set of these decisions involved in STEM problem-solving in general. And a number of these you'll see overlap general ideas of critical thinking, but some of them are also quite STEM specific. And so, things like what concepts are relevant, how to decompose the problem into parts, deciding what assumptions and simplifications are appropriate, what information's needed, how good is the information one has and what you can conclude from it, and deciding how good your tentative solutions are, etc. And so these are the things one needs to be having the students practice. Normally, having them, the students would then work in small groups in the classroom, take advantage of the benefits of social learning on doing this kind of work on problem tasks. And so, directly practicing and justifying and evaluating these kind of problem-solving decisions in the context. So I'll say I'm giving sort of a high-level overview here. Mickey will talk much more detail about the details of the cognitive processes and students need to have and some of the teacher practices, I think. And just a few other details. The problems that they're solving, they need to be at the right level of challenge for the students, so they're difficult but not impossible. They build on the students' past knowledge, and the teacher needs to monitor the students' progress and thinking and provide timely, specific feedback to help them improve their thinking. And if you want to make better assessments, you need to have the assessments contain this kind of thinking, the actual making and justifying of relevant problem-solving decisions. So another aspect of the critical thinking in STEM, as mentioned earlier, it really requires some knowledge as well. And we see that although the decisions are the same across many different fields, the knowledge, the information needed to make those decisions is always quite context specific and therefore quite subject specific. And so the students also, as part of the learning, need to be provided with that information, but it's most effective if it's provided as it's needed for use. And this is kind of consistent with the ideas you may be familiar with Brown and Collins of situated cognition, of learning the knowledge as it's used rather than just isolated facts. So, but what do I see as really the most fundamental change in teaching required for this? Well, it's something that Andreas has already mentioned, is that you have to give the students much more agency so they have the opportunity to make decisions, to learn from the mistakes and improve on them. And so this is a way that we've got good data that can teach critical thinking, but it doesn't really teach creativity. Creativity is sort of a separate and in some ways more difficult. It's an inherent challenge in the teaching and creativity in STEM. And the reason I say it's a sort of fundamental challenge is in the teaching of STEM, it's almost always in nearly every conditions, you give the students practice problems and examples to see where they always have a single correct answer. It's like, you know, a good scientist or engineer thinks about how to solve that problem and what the instructor is looking for. And this really establishes the goals for what students are to learn. But if you think about what this is doing in creativity, it's really suppressing creativity because it's encouraging students to think the way other people are already thinking as opposed to thinking in novel ways on their own. And there's a little bit of room for kind of individuality sometimes in how to justify these problem-solving decisions, but it's really quite limited. And so in practice, really to learn to think creatively, you have to come up with problems that don't have a single right answer, that have actually many possible solutions. And so the students have opportunities to come up with their own novel, creative solutions. And that's just a very hard thing to come up with. There are some examples of people who can do it in teaching STEM, but I know from experience it's really quite difficult. And it also requires kind of even greater student agency because the students now not only have control over making decisions and problems, but they also have more control over even defining what this solution would look like. So what's the most practical solution? Well, now I'm getting away from research and just giving my own opinion, but I think it's probably to actually do this in a larger scale. It really requires project-based courses where instead of students having a certain body of knowledge that they're expected to learn, in fact, they're given projects to solve where they actually have some control to choose the problem, and then they work for an extended period of time figuring out their own solution to the problem. And so that gives much our opportunity for creativity. I might say in passing that we have good data showing these kinds of activities are far more engaging for the students because pretty much anybody can see trying to think how to do things on your own is just much more engaging and fun than trying to learn how somebody else is doing things. But this leaves us with kind of an inherent tension in STEM education that I think you can't really avoid, which is the tension between, on the one hand, covering all the topics and material, the knowledge that one considers needed for a proper education in the field of science and engineering, versus providing students with the time, the opportunity for the learners to pursue these kind of projects and open-ended thinking practice and that develop creativity and engagement. And although I recognize it really always is going to have to be some kind of choices and compromise here. My own opinion is that institutions and teachers almost always err on the side of focusing too much on covering all that content, much of what the students won't actually need, and as a result really sacrificing some of these other important educational value that they could have. So just to finish up here, I'll argue that current teaching is largely about presenting knowledge, and it's not very good at developing critical thinking and creativity. But these new research-based methods that are teaching critical thinking are still not typical, but they are becoming more widely used. And these provide more student agency and practice the desired thinking you want them to acquire in class. But it does require teacher training on how to teach this way, so that's one difference that's needed for developing this more. And teaching creativity, though, is a bigger challenge, and it requires greater student agency, these problems without correct answers, likely more projects for them to do. And this is harder to fit into the conventional curriculum and assessments as people have talked about repeatedly, are particularly challenging in this area. And I think to solve this problem, it's going to require even greater sort of institutional change and approach to the curriculum and their educational needs. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Carl. I should have probably said earlier on that the aim of the session is to be a bit more interactive, so we are going to have some opportunity for a Q&A with Carl now. So if anyone has any questions, we have some people who will be running mics around the room, so just raise your hand and someone will bring a mic to you, and the same with Mickey. And we might even flip the script a little bit later and get you to do be students in this session too. So yeah, we have a question at the back for Carl.
And one over here too also.
I didn't think I need to use a microphone, but thank you very much for the presentation. I'm kind of curious about how your takes on about, you're emphasizing the importance of the, student agency, giving the student agency. I completely agree with it, but at the same time that we also have to consider that, giving the student agency comes with a risk, right? The risk is not about on the teacher, but the risk of a student getting the agency. Basically, the student who are lower performing students or a lower social economic status, or even the student in a politically disadvantaged class, it would be difficult for them to exercise the agency because it comes with a risk. The risk usually does not apply to the students who have, politically advantaged, economically advantaged, and families having a good family. They don't have a risk. So how do you consider, how do you position about those risks when we are trying to push about student agency?
So I think what we've seen is that the way to deal, you have to deal with that as a teacher, but it's really about setting a culture, what the teacher says and has the students do to set a culture within the classroom of this is the appropriate behavior of what you do. You also have to make sure that the kind of activities you have for the students kind of match their background so that even the less prepared ones can get fully engaged in these activities. But mostly the point you're talking about is really setting the classroom culture by just talking about what you're doing, setting clear expectations as a teacher. And I think we have pretty good data showing that if you do that right, you can be quite successful.
Thanks, Carl. Another question, the lady in the black top here. Raise your hand.
Thank you very much. Mo from Brookings Institution. I deeply appreciate the way that OECD defines creativity, the ideas around generation, evaluation, and improvement of ideas. There's a little part of me, though, that's asking this question. It's this tiny little voice that is saying, within the context of scientific endeavor, are there some fields that we perhaps want people to be less creative in? My mind is going to my gynecologist and to the pilot that flew me here. And I'm just wondering whether there's any scope for thinking about whether and the extent to which, creativity in the different ways that we define it might be required when it comes to science.
Yes. So what I would argue is probably certainly what the pilot's doing and probably what your gynecologist is doing is not really, most of the time, is not science. And science is sort of, what scientists and engineers spend their time doing is figuring out new problems that essentially you get a technician to do the routine work. And doctors often are kind of in the middle, frankly, of an awful lot of what they do is very routine, and you want them to follow a very set of procedures, and so it's not very scientific at all. Of course, you also need them to be open enough to recognize when something isn't standard, and they need to be creative in solutions. So I think you just need the appropriate balance there. But really, for the vast majority of activities, you want people to be creative, and a lot of times there's small creativity where it's a little, needs something done a little different than is kind of standard, but it's not a big difference, and it's not so earth-shaking, and we think of that as not terribly creative. And then there's other things that are just much bigger changes that open up completely new insights, and we think of that as very highly creative. And there's kind of room for both in a lot of most science activities, I would say.
And maybe just to add to that, in the context of PISA, so we obviously assessed creative thinking in 4 different domains: tutor problem solving, tutor and expression. And the way that we scored was there was a first step in the scoring process to define whether response was appropriate or not. And that threshold was quite low deliberately, but obviously in the problem solving context, what is an appropriate idea, the threshold is probably a little bit higher than in an expressive domain where, frankly, if you made any connection to the stimulus, your idea was appropriate. Whereas in problem solving, the criteria is maybe a little bit strengthened in terms of what is an appropriate idea for this problem.
Yeah, that was my own complaint, actually, as I think in science there's more need for a detailed evaluation of how good something really is. That's hard to capture.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, we'll go to the gentleman in the jumper, and then the man in the tie, and then the man in the forefront in the tie. Who raised their hand to narrow it?
Professor, hi. Franco Mosso from Enseña Peru. My question was about what you said, that knowledge is required to problem solve. There is an amount of knowledge. No? So it brought me back to, I work in rural areas in Peru, and I was talking to a group of teachers in one of our rural areas, analyzing data of student performance. And essentially what was happening there is 14 and 15-year-olds were essentially performing at the level of first grade, elementary school. And they had, they knew numbers, they knew addition and subtraction, but that was pretty much it. And this is in the context of an enormously overloaded curriculum. And so my question is, could you expand a bit more on how would you think, where is the threshold of knowledge in contexts like that to unlock creative thinking? I bet that is not addition and subtraction. I bet that is a bit more, but how would you, what are the main questions that you will ask yourself to get to that unlocking point, so to speak?
The questions I ask myself is, I look at these specific problem-solving decisions that we've identified, and then I ask, okay, in the context of the problem the students are working on solving, what's the knowledge needed to make those decisions? And so that's relevant to the particular problem context, and of course the problem has to be at an appropriate level of challenge to reflect, for the students, and so, but that's what the way I look at it is. I look and see, okay, to make the appropriate decision in here, you need some amount of knowledge, and so what is that knowledge for the problem you chose to give them?
Maybe just in the interest of time, I'll ask that both questions are asked, and then Carl to respond.
Thank you. Thomas O'Rourke from the Irish Ministry. So 2 questions. One, just picking up on the last discussion, the idea of the knowledge being relevant to the problem-making decision, the problem you're trying to solve. If you don't know what you don't know at the outset, the importance of research in that, could you say a bit more about how research would work in that process? But secondly, looking at that conundrum you identified of HEIs tend to err on the side of excess coverage versus space and time, could you say a bit more about, in your experience, why that is? I'm thinking of research our National Council for Special Education did on inclusion amongst teacher educators and teachers, who A, agreed it was one of the most important things that needed to be addressed, but B, felt it was the area they were least confident in their own abilities to address. So kind of an analogous situation, perhaps. So on both those questions, I appreciate your views. But I'll hand over to my colleague here now.
Thank you. And I'll have the second question.
Okay, so I'll try to answer all the questions.
Give you.
Thank you very much. And it's probably two questions in line with the last ones. One is that what you are describing, I think it's from the natural sciences, but to find different solutions, it's very natural in the social sciences. So what can you learn from social sciences into the natural sciences on this particular issue? The other question is about the usability of the results. That's a big and difficult question because that's a timeline. When will it be usable? For instance, when you have this new vaccine on COVID, it was probably the science was done 40 years ago, and it wasn't used before it suddenly appeared solving particularly solving the COVID crisis and vaccines. So that's a kind of a time limit for the usability aspect of it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, the usability doesn't mean that it has to be immediate applications of it. What I merely mean is it has to be appreciated in the context of scientific work, that there's value recognized. And so there, I think it goes 40 years ago, people studying that understood. Now, let's see, I have trouble remembering all the different questions. What was the first one you asked? It's about, oh, the social sciences. So my own opinion is that it applies almost certainly very directly to the social sciences, but we don't have the data on that. We don't have the data on teaching in this way to make those claims like we can for sciences. And I forget the other questions too. Why AGIs are more on coverage than on... Oh, yeah. So, I've worked a lot with university departments and faculty, and this coverage is always a struggle. We talk about sort of tyranny of content, and that it's really just kind of a cultural value system of, oh, I need to cover all this material, and with no real rational reason. I think my own explanation is that in science and engineering, there's always new knowledge coming along, and so the faculty think, well, I got to make sure the students learn everything I learned when I was a student, because obviously that's vital. But then they've got to learn all this new stuff too that's come along since I was in school, and so they just think, okay, I've got to cram more and more in, even though it makes very little sense. Okay.
Thanks so much, Carl. Thank you all for your questions too. I'm glad the coffee break helped to inspire people's confidence to ask questions. So now we'll turn to Mickey for your keynote presentation on the more practical side of how teachers actually design more active learning experiences.
Okay, I tend to talk fast, but anyway, we'll see. So what I'm going to talk about today is a theory of how students engage to learn called ICAP that can be translated into pedagogy. So people use the term engage a lot in that way, in that general way, just say engage, and it means involved in or interact with. But one really needs to specify with who you engage with or with what you engage with, and more importantly, how you interact with whoever you're engaging with. So suppose students are engaged in schools. Now you're specifying what the X is, schools. And then you can, once you say that, you can specify the interactions. What does it mean to be engaged with schools? So things like you attend classes or you turn in homework. So that could be quantified. So how much are you engaging? So ICAP focuses on students engaging with instruction, and by instruction we mean the instructional materials, the format of the delivery, and the instructional activities, sort of all the above. But it is not clear how exactly, what are all the ways in which students can in fact interact with instruction. So the traditional goal of gold standard of engagement with instruction considers only a very single binary kind of interaction called paying attention, right? Or not. So you're either paying attention, you're on task and engaged, or you're not, which is you're disengaged and distracted. So students are typically expected to pay attention when teachers teach by telling, which is about 50 to 68% of the college classroom proportion. So as this cartoon says, Einstein, stop fooling around and pay attention. That's what we all think about when we lecture or explain. We expect students to pay attention. So when students only pay attention, we call that passive learning. That's when instructors lecture. But however, students turns out to learn significantly more when instructors teach in other ways, and that's called active learning. And then the difference is quite significant, and there's a very well-known meta-analysis by Freeman that talks about that. And he analyzed 225 college STEM courses, and active learning classes clearly outperform non-lecture classes. So then this suggests the fact that if teachers teach in different ways and students learn a lot better, this clearly suggests that students must be interacting with instruction in many other ways that we're not aware of, we don't know about, other than paying attention. So what are these other ways that students can interact with instruction? So to answer this question, we need to first consider how students learn, or the basic idea first, what is learning? So the way I conceive of learning is that learning is making changes to one's initial knowledge or mental model or understanding. So the person on the left is a student with an initial mental model that doesn't look anything like the expert mental model about the circulatory system on the right. So in learning, the student is constantly continuously trying to fit incoming new information into her existing knowledge or mental model, requiring various cognitive processes such as activating, changing, connecting, comparing, inferring, classifying, rearranging, all kinds of processes that we can't really isolate because, or see because it's covert. So they do undergo all these processes to eventually approximate the expert's correct or complete mental model. So as you can see, so suppose the teacher explains, in the lungs carbon dioxide leaves the circulating blood and oxygen enters it. It could be a sentence you read from text. That sentence is actually very difficult for students to integrate because the student's initial model doesn't even have lungs in the circulatory system. So therefore, learning, students must constantly change their incorporate new information, and that also explains why it takes time, which I'll address a little bit later. Teaching, however, is typically instructor explaining his expert mental model, and rather than helping student change her initial mental model. So there's a disconnect between teaching and learning. So to identify how else students can interact with instruction besides paying attention, ICAP makes three critical assumptions. The assumption is that we can define and, in fact, roughly discriminate 4 sets or incremental stages of internal covert learning processes. And that there's also 4 modes of student external overt engagement behaviors or physical interactions that we can also identify, discriminate. And it's defined by 2 critical external criteria that we can define. And that the 4 stages of covert learning processes correspond more or less to we can say they correspond to the 4 modes of overt behavior. So in fact, I'm just making the correspondings. So the goal of these assumptions is to find an external proxy for internal learning processes that we can't see. So the instructors can use these external criteria to design the active learning classrooms, including activities and everything. So I'm going to show you now the 4 assumptions. First, the content processes that I can segregate into 4 sets. The 4 distinct sets of covert processes starts with students encode new information. That is, they store new information that's coming in. P stands for prior knowledge, N stands for new knowledge. The second set is activating selected parts of prior knowledge. So you can think about some knowledge and you can activate it. So it's just, well, it gets activated. The third thing is you can make inferences where you connect some pieces of knowledge or rearrange some knowledge, so that's the infer stage. And finally, you can work with a partner, and so the advantage working with partners is that peer 1 on the left can make an inference X, and then he can articulate that X, so you're collaborating. And then peer 2 can encode that X, and peer 2 makes the inference of Y. Okay, the advantage of this is that peer 2 could not have made inference Y without peer 1 making the inference X. You'll see later, I'll refer to this, how important that is. Okay, I call that co-inferring. Okay, so that's 4 stages. Now, what are the 4 distinct modes of overt behaviors that can be discriminated and characterized by 2 concrete visible criteria? The first criterion is the nature of the overt physical interaction with instruction. This criterion is a little bit more relevant for K-12. The second criterion is the content of the externalized output produced, if any. This criterion is more relevant for more college sort of activities. So the first criterion are things like paying attention, manipulating instructional materials, generating new knowledge, or co-generating. And the second criterion is whether you produce any output, whether the outputs are part of the inputs, whether the outputs go beyond the inputs, and whether the outputs go beyond your own inputs and your partner's input. So now let's put all this together. I'm going to illustrate it. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. So encode internal process correspond to the behavior of paying attention, which is what I said, which produces no output. Okay, so what are examples? You can listen to a lecture or explanation, you produce no output. You can look up or read some handout, you produce no output. You can watch a video on the screen, you produce no output. So this is the encoding stage, or the stage of paying attention. The second level is you go activating process correspond to the behavior manipulating the given instructional materials and with outputs that produce, which is part of the original input. So you produce no new output, you simply manipulate the input you were given. So example is you're highlighting sentence, or you clip and highlight the sentences. The sentences you highlight is part of the instructional material, there's nothing new. Or you copy notes, so the notes is identical to what was presented. Or you do a lot of measurement in the lab where the equipment and the liquids are all provided. So in all these cases, you're not producing any new information. You're simply activating, by doing this thing, you're activating some knowledge. And you're selecting and activating. So the third, infer processes correspond to the behavior of generating some knowledge, right? So the output produced, which I italicized below, contain knowledge beyond information provided in the instructional information. So for example, if you drew a link, or one link, or an entire concept map, clearly the link and the concept maps were not, let's assume, were not instructional material. Or you can take notes in your own words. You can take a single note, or you can take a page of cumulative notes. Or you can explain the reason. So you're generating knowledge beyond what was given. Finally, we talked about the importance of co-inferring, which corresponds to the behavior of what I call reciprocally co-generating with a peer, in that, as I illustrated, each partner's outputs are beyond the instruction and beyond the partner's outputs, and beyond your own outputs and partner's outputs. So we're thinking that perhaps debating with each other is like that, co-editing together is like that, and exchanging ideas. It's not guaranteed unless you analyze the actual output. So this is just a summary table. So we added labels. So interactive is simply co-generative and extends beyond instruction, and it's co-infer. Constructive is simply generative. You only extend beyond instruction, not beyond the partners, or you're inferring. Active is you manipulate, and passive is you just pay attention with no output. So those, we're going to start using those new labels. Okay, the 4 stages of learning processes from encoding to infer are incrementally more complicated, and therefore leading to the ICAP hypothesis about the decrease in learning from the interactive mode to the inferring mode to the activating mode to the encoding mode. Okay, we call this the ICAP. And it's the ICAP hypothesis. The ICAP hypothesis are supported by hundreds of studies that's already out in the literature, published before ICAP came along. So the way this, you can show that these already published studies support ICAP is by reinterpreting the manipulations in the study into an ICAP mode. So let me give you 3 examples. So here's a study published by Okada and Herb Simon, where when you solve a discovery task by exchanging justification and explanation with a peer, that is, you perform much better than solving discovery tasks individually. Well, according to ICAP, that's because I is better than C. Similarly, if you add information on a partial concept map and compare that reading, which is a lot better than reading a map taking verbatim notes, again, that can be explained by C is better than A, constructed is better than A. Finally, if you take notes while watching video lecture, that's better than watching video lecture only without taking notes. Well, that's taking notes could be A or C, depends on what kind of notes you take, and then that's better than passive. So there's many, many, many studies of this nature where I can impose the ICAP mode on them and make a generalized interpretation for all the studies, rather than specific interpretation. Results of these studies, that they would say things like, oh, adding information on map is a good thing to do for students, rather than just a generative task is a good thing for the students. Okay, now I'm going to give some caution to the interactive mode. And I'm going to go on the left column first. Interactive collaborative mode is rarely reciprocally co-generative the way we defined it. And we can use ICAP mode to code the mode of each contribution in an utterance, in a dialogue utterance. Such coding shows that collaborative dialogues are rarely co-generative. It's much less than 20%. This is why the evidence in collaboration is not consistent. Sometimes collaborative learning is good, sometimes it's not. That's because it depends on the kind of dialogue pattern students engage in. So on the left, it shows the common non-generative, co-generative dialogue patterns. Typically, one partner dominates, you can do divide and conquer, you can work in parallel, or the partners could interact, but then they don't interact in a co-generative way. They could be, one could be active, the other active, passive, active. They could even both be constructive and work in parallel. That's probably pretty close to co-generative, but not necessarily. Therefore, learning small groups or dyads is not always better than constructive. It's almost always better than passive, almost better than active or equal to active, but it could actually be worse than constructive, depends on how they do it. So here's where the creativity of my part of the talk comes in just a little bit. So when you have co-generative dialogue, reciprocally co-generative dialogue, each person is generating beyond the other person's inference, not beyond the other person's knowledge. So you could have 2 people with identical knowledge, and yet they can come up with something creative, because you could be generating inference that I didn't think about, but I can build on your inference. And therefore, you could generate a creative product that neither person, or outcome that neither person could have generated alone. Okay, let's practice applying theory into practice. So this is a very famous result back in 1982 by Noreen Webb. Which peer learns more, the one giving explanation or the one receiving explanations? Who says receiving explanations? Who says giving explanations? Right, so the one, that's what the results show, and it wasn't, it was a very puzzling result that the one who's giving explanation actually learned more. Because paying attention and collaborating modes of behavior that's easy for instructors to detect and discriminate, the critical difference for instructors to learn to discriminate is between manipulating and generating. They're both active learning modes. So why do we want to discriminate those 2 things particularly, so that instructors can focus on improving those, upgrading instruction? For 3 reasons. First, both K-12 teachers and college instructors tend to use more active instruction and far less constructive. And I'll have 2 pieces of data to show you later. The second is that there's actually a greater gap in the learning outcome between the active and the constructive modes. So on the right is a results from our own lab where we manipulated whether engineering students, whether they read a passage, which is passive, they read a passage and underlined it, which is active, they explain a graph or they explain it with a peer. So we manipulate these four things, and what you'll see is that the biggest gap of pre-test, post-test, pre-test is blue, post-test is red. Pre-test, post-test are all significant. But what is more significant is the difference in the post-test between the active and the constructive mode with less percentage gain between the other modes. Anyway, so there's a sharp, much more of an increase, significant increase between active and constructive, and that's really what we want to focus on. Also, the active and passive modes, the active and passive mode leads to shallower understanding, whereas the constructive and potential interactive mode leads to much deeper learning, which I think about is more like critical thinking. You can think more deeply. And the evidence comes from the fact that if you're constructive, you're much more able to answer correctly difficult questions. Okay, so to achieve active learning, instructors tend to know to avoid passive by including active participation kind of activities and interactive collaborative activities. That's how active classrooms are designed right now. But A elicits shallow understanding and I is unreliable. So the overlooked and easily implemented sweet spot mode is the constructive one. So that's what we really want instructors to focus on. So clarification. Many activities designed by STEM instructors for students are constructive and effective for learning, but they tend to be complicated and lengthy for instructors to design and time-consuming for students to undertake. So a lot of problem-based learning are like that. They're great, but they're very time-consuming. So in contrast, ICAP promotes simple upgrading to constructive mode for all phases of learning, not just have students execute complex, standalone, lengthy activities. So that's the difference of what we're promoting. So now I'm going to show you 3 examples, more than 3, 5 examples of how to apply ICAP in 3 different phases of learning, the 3 different phases of presentation phase, homework task, and in-class activities. So the first example, in the presentation phase, how to improve lecturing while students listen or watch a video. So one simple thing to do is simply pause frequently because, as we said in learning, it takes student time to integrate new information and repair their mental model. And that while you pause, you can elicit generative responses from students. And this is, I just generate these ideas. I'm sure they're out there. So you can ask students to reflect, ask students to find errors in a solution that you put on the board that has an error, ask them to explain, ask them to write down things, and so on and so on. However, more importantly, you want to ask students a question, but the question, how do you ask them a question? So the issue is not to ask students a good question. What we want to do is ask students a constructive question. That's a difference. So how do we ask students a constructive question? Well, it turns out you can use ICAP's second criterion again to actually code questions based on what you expect the student's response to be. So for example, a passive question that is more prevalent in K-12 require no responses from students. The teacher might say, what's the key to survival in the wild? It's hidden within the strategy predator-prey, right? So teachers in K-12 tend to ask this kind of question. Active is to ask people to recall information that was previously taught, so it was already presented. However, what we want to do is look at constructive question, which asks students to generate responses going beyond the presented material. Same definition, such as provide an example illustrating how both predators and prey adapt to maintain ecological balance. And finally, you can have ask in your class interactive questions. That is, ask one student to respond to another student's comment. So it's very easy now to think about questions and whether they're a constructive question or not a constructive question. I believe one of the activities on the table has other questions for you to think about. Okay, I want to contrast the approach to improving lecture versus other recommendations. Our approach. So the approach to improve lectures out there is to basically improve your content, clarity, organization, synthesis, and so on. The format of the content and adding visual, adding animation, adding graphs, adding subheadings, whatever. And the presentation style. So there's talks, you know, the ideas about use storytelling or talk and talk out loud as you solve problems so students can see your thought processes. All these recommendations, students remain passive, right? So the difference in the way ICAP approach is that we're just saying that what you should do to change your lecture is elicit constructive responses from the student. You don't need to change your lecture at all. You just need this. You just add this opportunity to elicit constructive response by inserting pauses. Now, one other thing to note: feedback is actually not necessary to students' generative responses. It turns out that, yes, sometimes you can generate incorrect responses. If you simply ask them to generate responses, whether or not they have some errors in them, that's still better than not asking them to generate responses. However, it may be the case that adding feedback would make it even better. There's just I don't have any evidence for that directly. I haven't found any, but I don't have any. So now let's look at the design of homework phase. A key component of exercise or activities that instructors design is what I call instructional directives or commands, what the students need to do in the activity, right? So these commands turns out to contain verbs. So come up with a rationale, delete the irrelevant information, or comment on the reasons given. Okay, so these commands and the exercises tends to have a verb. Turns out, again, as in the case of classifying questions, we can use ICAP mode to classify these verbs, and then that's relatively easy as well. So, so by using the second criterion, whether the expected outcome goes beyond the instructional material or not, you can classify verb as either active or constructive, and there's an example in on your worksheet. So here's some examples we can show right now. You can have passive verbs, and it would say things like, listen to me, look at the blackboard, go through it, review, da-da-da. You can have active verbs such as describe the diagram, so you're not adding anything, just describing it. Sort this thing into piles, follow the example, match the similar ones. You can have constructive verbs, things like explain, da-da-da, make up something, imagine and draw, and justify. And then, of course, you could have interactive verbs like exchange, debate, so on. Okay, what I want you to notice is the numbers in the parentheses. The number in the parentheses are actual mode of the verbs and the exercises in a study we ran with K-12 teachers. Now, this is many years ago. We did teach them about ICAP, but our PD wasn't very good. But you can see, even after we taught them, they still predominantly use active verbs. This is K-12. And the number of active verbs they use is twice as much as constructive verbs. Okay, applying tips again. Which column verse is more generative and which one is more active? So let's go to the first one. If you have a column verbs like choose, copy, click, follow, fill in, who says that one is active? Very few. Okay, now go to the second column. If you have a column on comments on, compare, contrast, come up with, determine, decide, who says that's constructive? Right, that column it's easy to decide that's constructive. So let's take compare or contrast. When you do compare and contrast, what you're doing is asking the students to come up with similarities and differences, right? Similarity and differences were not presented. That's why you're doing compare and contrast. So that's clearly constructive. So you just need to use the second criterion of deciding what is expected. Some verbs, however, you do need to consider other factors like the noun phrase after the context or prior knowledge a little bit. So it's not clear for all verbs, obviously. So for example, if you say connect the dots, that's active. If you say connect the two ideas, that's probably constructive. Illustrate, you can illustrate the wing shapes, that's probably active. Illustrate the source of the problem, that's probably constructive. So on, you get the idea. Okay. I'm going to show you two actual instructors' examples from ASU, and we did not give these instructors feedback, but just to show you how easy it is to upgrade the activities. The first one comes from a geology professor. He's only read my paper. We didn't give him any PD. And in 2018, the thing on the left is the exercise he gave students, and it's called the match the rock type to the sedimentary deposit. Okay, and then in 2019, after he read our paper, he changed it to identify, predict, and interpret. So identify is probably more like the active verb. I would say that's an active verb, but predict and interpret is constructive. A lot of people ask me questions whether you should do an active for something active first and then generative. And that may be true because you want to activate your memory and then you want to make inferences. But we didn't really test those sequencing kind of modes yet. But there's a little bit data outside that addresses sequencing. Okay, here's another example. Wait. Here's another example. This instructor just took our PD. We just tried a new PD, and she just made all these changes herself. So the black bolder words is original verbs like determine, which part, and so on. And the red is this new stuff she just added it. So I'm just indicating it's quite easy. Okay, now I'm going to give you an example for the in-class activities phase. Understanding an ICAP can prevent adverse changes to in-class activities. So a very popular in-class activities is use of clickers, right? And the clickers has 4 phases. The first phase is you choose an answer, and then you see the bar, and then you discuss it with your peer, and then you choose your answer again. But most instructors eliminate the discussion part. Well, then they really reduce the effectiveness of this clicker because one of the most important part of this usage is the discussion. So if you understood ICAP, you would say, well, I wouldn't want to eliminate that part. And here's another example of chemistry professor, 6 online chemistry professors lesson plan. So one of the graduate students took the look at the lesson plan and actually counted how many minutes of the activity for the whole class semester is active, how many minutes passive, and constructive and generative, so on. So you can see of the minutes, 87% of the time was spent on shallow ways of learning, active and passive. This is actual online courses. So this is, I'm not going to give you any more example. We're translating ICAP into practice by offering PD training. And I want to indicate that our PD approach is very different from standard PD approach. The standard PD trains instructors on specific skills, how to use some specific technology, tools, and so on, or some problem-solving processes, or how to use some specific strategies. More content knowledge and more pedagogical content knowledge. Okay, those are all very typical type of thing PDs teach. Our goal is quite different. Our goal is to help instructors understand ICAP so that their understanding gives them agency to design their own upgrades as they wish and practices. It gives them an opportunity to knowledge to evaluate. They can evaluate tools and lesson plans and strategies out there for adoption. And they can create assessment questions that elicit constructive activities. So researchers and practitioners out there are adapting ICAP in very creative new ways. And I only know about it if they send me a paper. So if you do it, send me a paper. So besides teaching active learning, I'll just summarize. I'll just say 3. A lot of them, I haven't read the papers in detail. One is training football coaches. This is a graduate student who finished a thesis in Australia. So turns out football coaches, the way they train their people is typically they go look for videos, which kind of video is the best, and they show it to them, and they get feedback to the video. Well, now he's telling them, well, you should talk to the players themselves and find out what they do. And anyway, so it's not just looking at video. The second one is public civic participation engagement. This is about a local climate change in Israel. And whenever people talk about civic engagement, they really look at the measure of attending as a form of success. That is, how many people did we draw to come to this climate change conference. And that's clearly only a passive engagement. So you want to do something much more than just having attendance. Another one is really covered as curriculum design and scheduling course offering in medical school. So it turns out pharmacology courses are usually taught separate from other basic science courses in medical schools. And this person looked at 10 medical schools, and they found that if a pharmacology course is taught along with foundational courses, then the teachers tend to be much more constructive in their teaching. I thought that was really clever. And it's just interesting. Okay, so just in summary, ICAP can provide guidelines for pedagogy based on how students engage to learn. The theory is evidence-based, parsimonious, with concrete operational definitions that is prescriptive. That part is really important. It's generalizable across domains, activities, K-12 to college, all phases and formats of learning, online, in-person, and hybrid. The hypothesis is predictive of large amounts of findings already in the literature, not only for teaching and learning, but for many other performances, such as finding an item in large space. For example, if you have to find something in a large space, do you explain to yourself, explain how you're going to do it? That would improve your performance. Or things like parent-child reading. When a parent reads to a child, if the parent asks a child questions, then they learn a lot better. So a lot of other contexts. And it can enhance deeper understanding, thus benefit STEM learning in particular. And the taxonomy provides coding criteria for various purposes in other contexts, like how to ask questions that we did, how to design activities, how to evaluate technology tools. You can look at these new technology tools for education and look at how many of those responses you make are active versus constructive, and we've done that. Contributions in dialogue, how to evaluate dialogue patterns. It can be extended and applied in other contexts, such as there's already a theory of off-task behavior, that is disengagement. They extended ICAP theory to a theory of disengagement. And things like I already mentioned, civic participation, football training, and museum visits, and use of apps. And also it prescribes how students should collaborate in a way with the potential to be creative. And we're also developing a mini training lesson to teach students, college students, how to collaborate in this way.
Thank you so much, Mickey. Take a breath.
I was just going to say, the theory was supported by evidence and translated to practice, and the practice provides a lot of more evidence for us to clarify our theory and how to further design practice.
Thanks, Mickey. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left of the session for any Q&A. Okay, one question over here. So we can transition from passive learners to interactive mode.
That's great.
Thank you so much. I'm Cindy Boortman, University of Twente. That was really insightful, and I wish at every conference where we talk about education there would be a keynote about how students actually learn. I was wondering, I can imagine teachers saying that teaching in this way takes a lot more time, and at the same time students and teachers assuming or saying it would take also a lot more psychological energy. And thinking about what was said this morning about overcrowded curricula, what do you think about this balance, and what would you say to teachers and maybe even students who sometimes say, especially at the end of the day, you know, sitting back and listening is also nice for a change?
Well, students love just sitting back, listening. Dolores, however his name, he actually has this beautiful data of looking at what students prefer, just sitting, listening, or whatever. They prefer sitting, listening. They think they learn the most, but in actuality, they don't learn very much. So you're basically raising the same question about coverage, less is more. So we have other data and other, with respect to other research, which actually shows that students who cover less but more deeply actually learn more. So we counted the number of concepts they cover in this one condition. There's just fewer concepts covered than another condition. And they actually learn less. And the analogy I give is it's like if you want to have a healthy life, you have to spend time exercising. So exercising takes time, but the result is you have a healthier life. And in this case, you have deeper understanding.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mickey. Any other? Yes, one more question over here.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mickey. I'm just kind of interested, I'm thinking of the subtitle of the conference, Evidence, Innovation and Creative Thinking in Education. Are you aware of ICAP helping to inform how teachers learn, particularly teachers and leaders learning through the use of research evidence? No.
I'm not aware of anything specific. No, there's a very big and broad effort, I think, in Germany. There's a big effort in Germany where the teachers are actually taught about ICAP. But usually people don't tell me about these efforts, so I don't really know about them very easily. Once in a while I'll get an email, but unless something is published, I have no access to it.
Okay. I'm just struck by the powerful potential commonalities between the kind of ICAP processes that students go through and the kind of ICAP process that teachers and leaders might go through using evidence.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Well, I have a question that I'll generate while we're waiting for the next question. So one important question is, what if students don't comply, right? That's definitely the case. If you ask them to do generative, they might not generative. Okay, what we found, what our evidence shows is that if you ask students to be generative, 42% of the time they'll give you a generative response. But if you don't ask them to generative, you just ask them to be active, only 7% of responses are generative. So even though they don't, you clearly don't get full participation, the compliance, but still, eliciting it is more likely to act, they're more likely to generate something if you elicit it. Okay. Question?
I have maybe a question that builds on what you just said. Do you have any evidence for, I mean, you mentioned that there are different types of activities, and sometimes it might be easier to start with an active question and then go to constructive. Do you have any evidence of whether constructive activities are appropriate for all ability levels or all age groups, or do you advocate for different types of activities for different types of students, or do you have any reflections on that question?
I haven't looked at student-specific thing, but I should clarify, when I say something is generative, I mean all you need to do is generate a little piece of knowledge beyond what you were given. Because the generation is a reflection of what changes you're trying to make to your mental model. So you could just generate a little piece of knowledge, but the accumulation is the continuity of it, the accumulation of it is that you're constantly changing your mental model and revising it and making it better.
Okay, one final question and then we'll close up for lunch. Can we have a mic?
Thank you for both presentations. Actually, they're really, really fascinating. What strikes me, though, is about both in the curriculum overload issue, the emphasis on knowledge, and the change in the form of teaching and learning that you're speaking about. How does that square with summative assessment that's used at the end of schooling and accreditation type assessments? Because those types of assessment, be they the A level, the Leaving Certificate in Ireland, the baccalaureate or whatever, they do tend to emphasize and reward the knowledge reproduction rather than the types of skills that you're both talking about. And is there any way, or have you come across any evidence that would help us to change those forms of assessment to encourage both the forms of teaching and the forms of critical thinking that you're talking about?
That's absolutely true. In fact, when we actually run studies, we can't just use the assessment that's provided in a textbook or something because they're just too shallow. And so because we want to show it can encourage deep thinking, deep understanding, more like critical thinking, we always have to add our own assessment in addition to get an effect. Because you're absolutely right, the assessment items are just, a lot of it is just recall, which is more active.
But then what do we do? Because in educational systems, we're stuck with the need for some form of summative assessment, be it at the end of a university program or the end of upper secondary education. Where is research, what is research telling us about what we could do to change those?
Carl, go ahead.
I don't know, but he probably knows.
So actually, I think a place to look is an OECD, another OECD book on assessing 21st century skills, where we wrote a chapter for it. But Mari, you led that, right? So, and Natalie both. So, don't you think that's actually a reasonable start for answering that question?
Yeah, I'll do some self-promo. So we having gone through the process of developing innovative assessments in PISA, we feel like we've learned a lot in the process, and also the fact that assessments are not, current assessments are not adequate for trying to measure or support the development of these skills. And if we want to be more serious about supporting the development of skills, we have to be able to measure them, right? Because it's a circle. So we had, Mara and myself, we have written a book called Innovating Assessments to measure and support complex skills, with some great contributions from other very distinguished researchers. So yeah, check it out. And on that note, let's have a final round of applause for Mickey and for Carl. Thank you very much.